The calendar pages turn backward 1491, 1390, 1200. Long before the first European ship appeared on the horizon, long before the word Africa was whispered in connection to this continent, there were people here, dark-skinned people, people with features that would later be called African by those who had never seen Africa. People whose descendants today might carry DNA that tells a story their history books never did. What if the narrative you've been told about your origins is only half the truth? What if your bloodline doesn't just cross the Atlantic, but also runs deep through the rivers, mountains, and plains of the Americas themselves? Today, we're diving into one of the most suppressed chapters of Indigenous and African American history. A chapter that reveals how colonial powers didn't just import slavery, they exported identity. Welcome back to the Black Arena, where we confront the uncomfortable truths that mainstream academia would rather keep buried. I'm your host, and today we're excavating a historical conspiracy so deep, so systematic, that it rewrote the very DNA of how millions of people understand themselves. For centuries, the official narrative has been carved in stone. African Americans are the descendants of Africans, period. Brought here against their will, with no prior connection to this land. But what happens when that stone begins to crack? What happens when we discover that many of the people classified as African slaves were actually indigenous to the Americas people, whose ancestors had walked this earth for millennia before any European colonist was even born? This isn't just about correcting historical records. This is about reclaiming identity. This is about understanding that the colonial project didn't just steal land and labor, it stole heritage, memory, and the right to know who you really are. The evidence we'll explore today comes from colonial records, DNA studies, historical testimonies, and the oral traditions that survived despite centuries of systematic erasure. Some of what we'll discuss will challenge everything you thought you knew about the formation of racial categories in America. Some of it will make you angry. All of it will make you think, because the truth is this: before there was a black and indigenous divide, before there were separate struggles for separate peoples, there was a unified resistance, one that colonial powers worked over time to fracture and forget. Let's start with what they don't teach in schools. When European explorers first arrived in the Americas, they encountered indigenous populations that defied their narrow understanding of what Indian people should look like. These weren't just the copper-skinned peoples that dominate textbook illustrations. Many indigenous tribes had dark skin, broad features, and tightly curled hair, physical characteristics that Europeans would later categorize as African. The Washita Nation of Louisiana, the Yamasee of Georgia and South Carolina, the Black Californians documented by early Spanish colonists, the dark-skinned peoples of the Caribbean islands, who Columbus himself described in his journals. Tribe after tribe, nation after nation, of indigenous Americans whose appearance challenged European racial categories before those categories were even fully formed. Here's where it gets interesting and disturbing. Rather than expanding their understanding of indigenous diversity, European colonists did something else entirely. They began to assume that any dark-skinned person they encountered must have somehow originated from Africa. This wasn't based on linguistics, cultural practices, or actual historical evidence. It was based purely on phenotype, on the dangerous idea that skin color and facial features could tell you someone's entire ancestral story. But think about this logically. If human beings migrated to the Americas tens of thousands of years ago, spreading across two massive continents and countless islands, developing distinct cultures, languages, and ways of life, why would we expect them all to look identical? The diversity of indigenous peoples across the Americas should have been expected, not erased. The Olmecs, often called the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, created massive stone heads with distinctly African features. But these heads were, carved over 1,000 years before any documented contact between Africa and the Americas. Were these representations of African visitors? Or were they representations of indigenous Americans who simply looked like what we now call African? The answer matters because it reveals the foundational lie of American racial classification. The idea that phenotype equals origin, that appearance determines ancestry, and that people who look a certain way must come from a certain place. Now we come to the heart of the conspiracy, what I call the Great Reclassification. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, systematic effort to redefine entire populations in service of colonial economics and control. Here's how it worked. As European settlements expanded, they encountered a problem. Indigenous peoples had legitimate claims to the land. They had treaties, territorial rights, and legal standing that complicated colonial expansion. But what if those indigenous peoples could be reclassified as something else? What if they could be stripped of their indigenous status and redesignated as African, as people with no inherent claim to American soil? This is where the transatlantic slave trade becomes not just a story of forced migration, but a story of identity theft on a continental scale. Many of the people recorded as African slaves in colonial documents were actually indigenous Americans who had been enslaved in their own homeland and then legally reclassified to justify their bondage. Think about the logistics. If you're a colonial administrator and you encounter a dark-skinned person in bondage, what's easier? Conducting a detailed investigation into their tribal affiliation, family history, and territorial rights, or simply writing African in your ledger and moving on? The latter option not only saves time, it eliminates legal complications. An African slave has no claim to American land. An indigenous person does. The 1790 census provides fascinating evidence of this reclassification in action. Thousands of people listed as mulatto or free people of color were actually indigenous peoples who had been stripped of their tribal identity, but hadn't yet been fully absorbed into the African category. These were people in transition, caught between their authentic identity and their imposed classification. But the reclassification went beyond paperwork. It was cultural, psychological, and generational. Children born into slavery were told they were African. Their indigenous languages were forbidden. Their traditional practices were suppressed. Their connection to ancestral lands was severed. Within a generation or two, the process was complete. People who had been indigenous Americans became African Americans, not through migration, but through systematic identity erasure. This explains something that has puzzled historians for decades. Why do so many African American families have VAV? Oral traditions claiming indigenous ancestry? The mainstream academic response has been to dismiss these claims as Cherokee princess fantasies. But what if they're actually inherited memories of a different truth? Fast forward to the 21st century, and something revolutionary happens. DNA testing becomes accessible to everyday people. For the first time in history, African Americans could look beyond colonial records and slave ship manifests to uncover their true ancestral origins. And what they found changed everything. Study after study began revealing significant indigenous American ancestry in African American populations levels far higher than could be explained by the official historical narrative. The African Ancestry Project found that up to 30% of African Americans carry indigenous American DNA markers. The 23andMe database shows similar patterns across the United States, with indigenous ancestry appearing in African American profiles at rates that suggest systematic undercounting in historical records. But here's what's really shocking. When researchers looked at the specific indigenous markers showing up in these DNA tests, they weren't just from any Native American populations. They were disproportionately from tribes that had been documented as dark-skinned, From regions where early colonists had noted the presence of African-looking indigenous peoples. The Melungeon people of Appalachia provide a perfect case study. For generations, they were classified as mixed-race people of mysterious origin, too dark to be white, too indigenous-featured to be simply African. Recent DNA studies have revealed that many Melungeons carry both African and indigenous ancestry, but with indigenous markers that predate any documented African presence in the region. This suggests that what colonists interpreted as African features were actually indigenous characteristics that had been misclassified from the very beginning. Similar patterns appear among the Seminole Nation of Florida, the Lumbee of North Carolina, and dozens of other communities that maintained their indigenous identity despite colonial pressure to reclassify. These communities serve as living proof that the colonial categories of Black and Indian were artificial constructs that often failed to capture the complex reality of indigenous American diversity. The genetic evidence also reveals something else: resistance. Many African Americans who discover indigenous ancestry through DNA testing also discover that their ancestors deliberately preserved certain cultural practices, certain ways of knowing, certain connections to land that make perfect sense once the indigenous connection is understood. The sweet grass baskets of the Gullah people, the herbal medicine traditions passed down through generations, the spiritual practices that seem to have no African equivalent, but perfect parallels in indigenous American traditions. This wasn't accidental cultural retention. This was intentional cultural preservation by people who knew exactly who they were, even when the legal system insisted they were something else. You might wonder, if the evidence is so clear, why isn't this taught in schools? Why do mainstream historians continue to resist these findings? The answer takes us straight into the heart of how institutional power protects institutional narratives. First, there's the academic establishment. For generations, historians have built entire careers on the assumption that African American history begins with the slave trade. Admitting that many African Americans are also indigenous Americans doesn't just challenge individual research. Challenges entire departments, entire publishing industries, entire funding structures that depend on maintaining separate categories of African American studies and Native American studies. Then there's the legal dimension. Indigenous peoples have specific legal rights under federal law rights to land, resources, sovereignty, and reparations. If significant portions of the African American population are also indigenous, that potentially opens up legal claims that could fundamentally reshape land ownership, mineral rights, and political power across the United States. The economic implications are staggering. There's also the political dimension. The civil rights movement was built on the narrative of African Americans as people brought here against their will, with no prior claim to this land. That narrative generated sympathy and moral authority. An indigenous narrative generates something else entirely. It generates legal authority, territorial claims, and sovereign rights that go far beyond civil rights to encompass questions of original ownership and legitimate governance. Watch how quickly these conversations get shut down in academic settings. Watch how indigenous ancestry claims by African Americans get dismissed as genealogical fantasy, while similar claims by white Americans get treated as legitimate family history. Watch how DNA evidence that supports the official narrative gets celebrated, while DNA evidence that challenges it gets ignored or explained away. The suppression isn't just institutional, it's internalized. Many African Americans have been taught to view claims of indigenous ancestry as somehow betraying their African heritage, as if identity were a zero-sum game where claiming one ancestry means abandoning another. This false choice serves the interests of those who benefit from keeping these communities separated and their claims to this land obscured. But here's what the suppressors fear most: unity. They fear African Americans and Indigenous Americans recognizing their shared history, their shared struggle, and their shared claims to justice in this country. They fear the political and economic power that could emerge from that recognition. They fear a unified resistance that connects the dots between historical genocide, historical slavery, and ongoing systemic oppression. So where does this leave us? How do we move forward with this knowledge? How do we reclaim identity that has been systematically erased for centuries? First, we have to understand that reclaiming Indigenous identity is not about abandoning African identity. It's about embracing the fullness of who we are. Your ancestors may have crossed the Atlantic in slave ships and walked the Trail of Tears. They may have survived Middle Passage and survived Indigenous genocide. They may have carried forward both African spiritual traditions and Indigenous ways of knowing. This isn't contradiction. This is complexity. This is the beautiful, painful, powerful reality of survival in a colonial system designed to fragment and control. Second, we have to recognize that this knowledge comes with responsibility. If you carry Indigenous blood, you carry Indigenous obligations to the land, to the ancestors, to the ongoing struggle for Indigenous rights and sovereignty. This isn't about checking a box on a census form or claiming benefits you haven't earned. This is about understanding that your liberation is connected to Indigenous liberation, that your justice is connected to Indigenous justice. Third, we have to build bridges. The colonial system worked over time to separate African Americans and Indigenous Americans to make them see each other as competitors rather than cousins. Reclaiming our shared history means rebuilding those broken connections, supporting Indigenous rights movements, and recognizing that attacks on Indigenous sovereignty are also attacks on our own ancestral heritage. Fourth, we have to tell our own stories. The mainstream narrative will not change itself. Academic institutions will not voluntarily rewrite their textbooks. Government agencies will not spontaneously correct their historical records. The work of reclaiming identity has to come from us through independent research, through family history projects, through DNA testing, through connecting with Indigenous communities that have maintained their traditions despite centuries of pressure to assimilate. This is about more than personal identity. This is about collective power. When you understand that your roots go deep into this soil, that your ancestors' bones are buried in this earth, that your blood carries the memory of rivers and mountains and sacred sites across this continent, that knowledge changes how you move through the world. It changes what you're willing to accept. It changes what you're willing to fight for. The story I've shared with you today isn't just history, it's prophecy. It's a vision of what becomes possible when we stop accepting the identities that were imposed on us and start reclaiming the identities that were stolen from us. Every DNA test that reveals Indigenous ancestry is an act of resistance. Every family that reconnects with Indigenous traditions is an act of reclamation. Every African American who understands their connection to this land is a threat to the colonial system that depends on our displacement and division. The colonizers thought they had won. They thought they had successfully erased Indigenous identity, successfully imported replacement populations, successfully created a racial hierarchy that would maintain their control forever. But they made a critical error. They assumed that blood has no memory, that DNA carries no truth, that the ancestors have no voice. They were wrong. Your ancestors are speaking through genetic markers that refuse to be silenced, through oral traditions that survived centuries of suppression, through dreams and intuitions and connections to land that make perfect sense once you understand who you really are. The question isn't whether this information is true. The evidence speaks for itself. The question is what you're going to do with this truth, how you're going to let it change you, how you're going to let it change your understanding of justice, of belonging, of what you're owed, and what you owe others. This is your invitation to step into the fullness of your identity, to honor all of your ancestors, the ones who crossed the ocean and the ones who were already here, to claim all of your heritage, the African wisdom and the indigenous knowledge, to fight for all of your rights, civil rights and sovereign rights, human rights and land rights. The Black Arena exists because conversations like this one can't happen anywhere else. If this video has opened your eyes, if it's challenged your assumptions, if it's given you a new framework for understanding yourself and your place in this country, then share it, like it, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started. The revolution isn't coming, it's already here. It's happening every time someone discovers their true heritage. Every time someone refuses to accept the colonial categories that were designed to control them. Every time someone chooses wholeness over division, truth over comfort, identity over assimilation. Your ancestors fought to survive so that you could be here to reclaim what was taken. Don't let their sacrifice be in vain. Welcome to the Black Arena. Welcome to the revolution of consciousness. Welcome home. Subscribe for more hidden history and suppressed truths. Like, if this changed your perspective, share with someone who needs to hear this, and commit with your own family stories and DNA discoveries. Next week, we shall uncover the indigenous slave trade, how Native Americans became African in colonial records. Remember, your DNA is your documentation. Your truth is your resistance.